Mm. So I wanted to talk this evening about uh, the most broad way, what it means to walk a spiritual path. And there are many iterations of this, but tonight I'm going to focus in particular on the first part of what's called the Eightfold Noble Path, which is the Eightfold Noble Path has three components. The first is wisdom, which is uh, what's called wise view and wise intention. And then the middle of the path is sila, ethics, virtue, morality. This is really the part of the path that has to do with how do we all get along. It's really about how we relate to one another. And it includes wise speech, wise action, wise livelihood, the components, the interactive components of our life. And then finally, the third aspect of the path is often referred to as bhavana, which means literally mind or mind and heart training. And it is how we deepen our wisdom, which is where we started at the top of the path, through our meditative practices. And this includes wise energy or effort or kind of wholeheartedness, wise mindfulness, and wise concentration. And these 8 steps of the path, they are actually not always linear. I just laid them out that way, but often they're depicted more as a wheel. Many of you have probably seen the wheel of the Dharma with 8 spokes. And each of those spokes is what keeps the wheel of the Dharma turning. And when one of the spokes is uh, overreached or under cultivated, then you get kind of a lumpy wheel, right? Which is one of the definitions of dukkha. Dukkha is the first of the Four Noble Truths, and it is usually translated as suffering, but one of my favorite definitions of dukkha is a wheel out of round, which kind of gives you the feeling of it, right? Like glunk, like there's something that's not quite smooth or fluid or has a sense of ease, right? And the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path are intimately connected. So the fourth Noble Truth is the Eightfold Path. So we have the first truth that there's suffering, the second truth that there's a cause of suffering, which is grasping or aversion, this tanha. We have the good news, which is what the Buddha said, that it's possible to be free. It's not possible to be free of unpleasant experience. I'm sorry about that, but it's not. That's not the promise the Buddha made. But what he did say was that it's possible to be free, right in the midst of the mess. And then the fourth noble truth is the truth of the path, which is the kind of practical how-to part of our practice. Sometimes the Buddha is described as a physician, and that the understanding that our path, our practice is one of healing and wholeness. And in this case, um, suffering is the diagnosis. How would you say? No, suffering is the condition. Tanha, grasping, which is rooted in ignorance, is the diagnosis, what causes the suffering. Um, Nirodha, the possibility of freedom, is the prognosis, which is it's good. And Magga, which is the path, is the prescription. Here's what to do. And as someone who tends to be pretty practically minded, I really appreciate that there's a path. That the Buddha didn't say, here's how it goes, see you later. good luck. He actually gave us something, right? And what's interesting is that the first step of the Eightfold Noble Path, if we're looking at it as a list rather than as a wheel, wise view. What is wise view? One of the most traditional descriptions of what wise view is the Four Noble Truths. So you see how it's circular? The fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path. The first step of the Eightfold Path is the Four Noble Truths. They go together. And in some ways, because the Buddha taught in a way that came down to us through an oral tradition, I've been doing a writing project, and I have a writing coach who is kind of she knows about Buddhism, but she's not super well versed in Buddhism. And she said to me recently, I'm learning so much, from reading what I'm sending her. And I said, well, tell me something you've learned. And she said, there are a lot of lists. And I said, yeah, that's because this was an oral tradition, and that's how people remembered things, right? We remembered the 4 these and the 3 that's and the 8 these, so that was the way people were able to remember what it was that the Buddha said. So tonight, I want to talk about the path, but I also want to talk about it in the context of something that is quite dear to my heart, which is what I call and have been teaching about, which is walking the Bodhisattva path. Now, this can be sometimes a little tricky for folks who are deeply immersed in the Theravada or insight meditation tradition, because technically, many people will say, oh, the Bodhisattva comes with the Mahayana and Vajrayana, the later teachings. It's actually not true. Bodhisattvas were alive and well in the very earliest part of the teaching. It's just that retroactively, there were kind of these divides made. And it's true that there's much more emphasis on Bodhisattva and Bodhisattva path in some of the later teachings. The reason that talking about a Bodhisattva, what a Bodhisattva is, and walking the Bodhisattva path feels so important to me now has to do with the state of the world. That we live in a time and place where there is so much difficulty. And maybe it's always been this way. Some of you have probably heard me tell stories about, my own research into the time of the Buddha, and knowing that that time and place also had its share of difficulty, of famine, of war, of, rise and fall of government structures and so on. But I think by anyone's estimation, this time right now, it's pretty tough. It's hard to look in any direction and not see difficulty, and particularly divisiveness. And for me, the archetype of a bodhisattva is something that we can try on as a way to consider how we might show up in the face of all of that. So the word bodhisattva, sattva is a being, but particularly a sentient being. So a bodhisattva, a bodhi means wise or awake, or I like awakening as an activity as opposed to as a noun. A wise, sensitive being. And in particular, a bodhisattva is understood as a being who's willing to stay open, to listen, to hear what's described as the cries of the world. And it's really important that as we open ourselves to the cries of the world, especially now, I don't think they had, social media at the time of the Buddha. It's so easy to feel overwhelmed, right? something happened. Something happened today. I can't remember what it was. And it was astonishing. It was like 4 minutes later, it had been reported in the New York Times. It's like, boom, we know immediately what's happening on the other side of the globe, right? So that's unique to our time. So we want to be careful in how much we turn toward and take in. And this is really a big part of our practice, is that our ability to take in and our ability to respond is grounded in wisdom. Otherwise, we become either hardened in some way, and we turn away, or we become burned out, overwhelmed. We can't stand it anymore. And probably for many of us, we do kind of go back and forth between going in and pulling back, as is appropriate. It's like a beating heart. We open and we close, as a way to take care of ourselves, to keep ourselves well in the midst of all of what's happening. So a bodhisattva is a being that takes in the cries of the world, and that is he, she, they are able to respond with a degree of skillfulness and kindness. And this isn't like a once and done, right? Whether we're walking all of the 8 stages of the path and continuing to adjust to make sure our Dharma wheel is in round, or we are, well, maybe that's a good enough way to talk about it for now. It's an ongoing process. That's what I want to say. It's not, we are walking the bodhisattva path, we get to the end and we're done. This is not a path with an end. This is a path that is made by walking. It is in our engagement that our own understanding and our own capacity to respond will deepen. So at the heart of the capacity of a bodhisattva is the wisdom of seeing into the truth of our fundamental non-separateness. This is from Einstein. Some of you may have heard a quote like this from Einstein. I just found this new version of it in a whole diatribe article in which it said Einstein was misquoted for many years in his thing, what he said about separation. So this is supposedly the latest and most accurate version. He said, a human being is part of the whole, called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. One experiences oneself, our thoughts and feelings, as something separate from the rest. We would say in more familiar language, as our thoughts, our feelings, it belongs to I, me, and mine. We identify with and we hold on to. One experiences oneself, our thoughts and feelings, as something separate from the rest, which he calls a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. So we have a consciousness, a mind that makes separation, that makes me over here and you over there. That's an illusion. When we believe that to be true, it becomes a delusion. When we act based on that delusion, we act in a way that is not particularly skillful or kind much of the time, right? So he says, the striving to free oneself from this delusion is the one issue of true religion. We might say it is the heart of walking the path. So I want to speak a little bit to the first 2 steps, or what I'm calling the first 2 steps or spokes, the wisdom basket, the Panya basket of the Eightfold Path, as a way of understanding the how to. How do we do that? Looking at my notes, I think I've gone through. Wow, I said all of that. Um, so the first bucket, basket, spoke, whatever you want to call it, is called samaditi, wise view. Sama is the word that often you may have seen if you've read about it, is translated as right, R-I-G-H-T. And this is one of many possible translations. It's not one that I like so much because it puts us into a kind of moralistic right and wrong mind, which is actually precisely what we're trying to close that gap, right? To bridge that divide. So, wise or appropriate or skillful. I often use wise for shorthand. I also like the translation of sama as writing, as in riding a sailboat. I don't know if anyone here has ever been sailing, but, or perhaps those of you who've ever tried to stand on one foot in balance or done mountain pose, something like that. There's a constant recalibration. There's a constant adjusting that's going on. That's the spirit of wise, whatever the step is, of writing, that it's a living process. As I said before, it's not a once and done. It also emphasizes the fact that to find the center, to find the heart of the path, is a process of constantly tipping off, right? We're constantly tipping to the left and to the right. The Buddha describes in what's called the Kaccayanagotta Sutta, which is, as many of the suttas are, it's his discourse to someone named Kaccayana. And Kaccayana asks the Buddha, tell me, what is wise view? Explain to me about wise view, and which is the first step. And the Buddha goes into this long sort of philosophical discourse about how we as human beings are constantly falling off on one side or the other to yes or no, is or is not, nihilism or eternalism. And the truth, what he says, what he calls the walking the middle path, is the truth in between. It is technically what he describes later as what is sometimes referred to as dependent origination or dependent co-arising. It's a dynamism. Because of this, that happens. Because of that, it is the truth of this interconnectedness that is at the heart of what a bodhisattva understands. So I've been reflecting a bunch about wise view, which, as I said, technically is wise view is the Four Noble Truths. But for our purposes as we walk the path, if that's the context, what wise view is like the orientation. There's a famous story some of you may have heard about the Buddha's walking in the forest with his congregation, and he stoops down and picks up a handful of leaves and says, "What do you think? Are there more leaves in my hand, or are there more leaves on all the trees in the forest?" And the monks, being, pretty sharp, they say, "There are more leaves on the trees than in your hand." And he says, "Yes, and just so. The things that I know, the things that I've seen, the capacity of my wisdom eye to open is like the leaves in the trees. But the things that I teach are like the leaves in my hand." And what the Buddha teaches, what the focus of the whole teaching is, summarized in the Four Noble Truths. Some of you have heard the phrase perhaps where the Buddha is reputed to have said, "I teach one thing and one thing only." suffering and the end of suffering. So of all the things he could teach about, he could have taught about metaphysics, he could have taught phenomenology, he could have taught, uh, the cosmic birth of the universe, he could have taught magical powers. There were many, many things that he knew and understand in his own experience, but they weren't important to him. What was important was to help us, human beings like him, understand suffering so that we could see and see through it, which is not the same as getting rid of it. It means that we understand how suffering works deeply enough that we don't perpetuate, that we don't deepen the divide. We are able to understand and behave in ways that begin to repair the cloth, right? So it's interesting to me that there's this kind of parallel between wise view, samaditi, and the third of what are called the upadanas, which are the things that the Buddha specifically said, don't cling to these, let go of these. And the third of them is also has ditti, view. And what the Buddha is saying is that one of the main things we need to learn to let go of is not clinging to our views and opinions. So we have view in both ways. On one hand, we have the wise view, which is to look directly at suffering and the end of suffering, to cultivate this path of freedom. And on the other hand, he's telling us very specifically, if you want to suffer more, here's how to do it. Hold on, right? Grip to your views and opinions. Now, views and opinions, like anything else, they're not bad. Views and opinions are just what happen. What the trouble is that when we grab on and we insist, we cling to, we cherish, because that's how we create the divide. That's how we say, no, I'm right and you're wrong. And I'm not suggesting that somebody else's views are better than yours. Trust me, there are people whose views I don't like as much as I like mine. But the attitude of insistence and clinging means I'm not open and receptive to understanding somebody else's point of view. I'm not humble enough to understand that my point of view is just my point of view. In fact, most of us don't even think that what we believe is our point of view. We just think it's true, right? Sometimes we don't even know we have a point of view until we bump up against somebody else with a different one, and they're like, oh, I just thought I was right. And then we find somebody or a situation that shows us that, oh, I see. This is actually really a great edge of practice to discover that for ourselves. So I'm not suggesting that you should abandon your values, that you should abandon your point of view. What I am suggesting is that you become aware that you, like all of us, have a point of view and that you hold it lightly. That I was reading something today, I can't remember what the character is, but it's a Chinese character for, it's translated as embracing and sustaining. And the character is, one part of it on the left side is of a hand, as in to give a hand, to lend a hand. It's the active side. And then the three parts on the other side of the character are all three different dimensions of the ear and listening. So it's suggesting that for us to be skillful, to be able to embrace and sustain our lives, each other, the world, that it would behoove us to do, 3/4 of the time we are listening, and 1/4 of the time we're responding. We're doing our best to lend a hand. And I don't know about you, but for me, a lot of times it's exactly the opposite, right? Quick to action, quick to make suggestions, quick to give advice, quick to give my opinions and views without listening first, right? Without hearing someone else's perspective. And then we do like this, right? And then that divide gets wider and wider until we have what we have now, which is we can barely even speak the same language. We're not listening at all to each other. And this does harm to all of us because very little functioning happens, right? The functioning that's needed to take care of the whole stops happening. So as we walk the path, I think of wise view as we're like standing at the top of a mountain, and the views and opinions, there's all these different possible ways down off the mountain. And wise view is to take a look at all the possibilities, to take it all in. And then what the Buddha is pointing to is here's this hand of leaves. The thing that we should be paying attention to as we walk, we could say suffering and the end of suffering. The shorthand for that is compassion. Cultivating the capacity to listen, to take in the cries, rooted in the understanding of our non-separation so that we can respond in a way that's skillful and kind. Now, if this were easy to do, we would all have done it already. So please don't feel bad about yourself as I'm making these suggestions. This is a path, right? And this is just the first part. In some ways, for me, I think often that the whole path is basically just a deepening and broadening of wise view. So as we move from wise view into the sila, the ethics button, bucket, basket component, that's where we broaden our view. We say, yes, I am interested in suffering and the end of suffering. And now the sila part is, how is this going to show up in my speech, in my action, in my work, in my family, in my life, in my relationships? That's the broadening of it. And then in the bottom of the path, or the bhavana, the mind training part of the wheel, that's where wise view really begins to deepen. And by that, what I mean is that it's no longer just an idea in our mind, that I want to be kind, that I want to see things clearly. But as we practice meditation, we have the opportunity to take whatever insight we have up here and to put it into the body, to deepen it so that it goes from out there to in here. We come to see for ourselves, as the Buddha said over and over. Now come, here are my words, now come, see for yourself. So it's in the meditative practice that, all the things I'm saying tonight, you get to try those on as you sit and see for yourself. How does it really work? Okay. So one more piece I want to say, and then we'll open for questions, which is that the second component of the wisdom part of the path is what's called wise intention. And this is so important. And if we go back to the top of the mountain and we're looking around, we're taking a broad view of all the possibilities and we're orienting in a particular way. But wise intention is when we go this way. This is the path I'm going to walk. We set our intention, right? It's like having a compass. This is the way I want to go. And intention, as many of you know, is what is considered the critical aspect of karma being action, which is just a way of saying You can't control the impact of your actions, but you can begin to pay attention to your intention. And all of karma, the Buddha said, hinges on intention. So intention is important. It's important both in a moment to moment way, you know, like what's my intention before I hit send? Just pause for a moment and consider. And for most of us, if we're honest, we see that our intentions are very often mixed, right? And that's okay. It's not saying never hit send, but it's an invitation to wake up. It's an invitation to start to pay attention and to stay awake in the context of your daily life. And maybe you won't hit send quite as often and you won't have to do all the cleanup that happens, you know, at least if you're me, when you hit send with very muddied or nefarious intention, you know, like I want to get that person back, right? Like that. So paying attention to our intention. This is part of the second part of the path. And the other is a much wider way of understanding it, which is what I call living by vow. That we have some degree of reflection and clarification in our own heart about our direction, about what we care about our own handful of leaves, about what matters to us. Because especially now when we can just be bombarded by content and, you know, mostly bad news, right? It's so important that we clarify for ourselves, you know, which way do I want to go? What do I want to pay attention to? And what am I going to let go of? Because we can't take it all in, right? Ryokan says, Buddha is your mind and the way goes nowhere. It's kind of the ultimate non-dual version of the path. Buddha is your mind and the way goes nowhere. Don't seek for anything but this. But then, he says, if you point your cart north when you want to go south, how will you arrive? So for me, I always think of this living by vow, this intention is the direction I'm pointing my cart. And this is not the same as your to-do list. Intention is not about a series of goals that you want to achieve. Goals are fine, tasks are fine, but this is a heart quality. This kind of intention is more like a wish, an aspiration. It has a stretch in it. Some of you know in the Zen tradition, we have what are called the four great vows, the Bodhisattva vows. Beings are numberless. I vow to save them. This is impossible because the point isn't to accomplish the task. The point is to feel that we want to. So I'm going to read because as I was researching this, I found my favorite version of an aspirational vow that I want to share with you, and then we'll take your questions. And this one comes from His Holiness, actually, the vow or prayer is from Shantideva, who was one of the great, he's an 8th century Indian pundit who wrote a text called the Bodhisattva Charya, which is about specifically the Bodhisattva path. And this is a prayer which the Dalai Lama says that he recites every morning. This is his Bodhisattva vow. This is what he says. For those of you who know Christianity, you will hear some echoes here. Shantideva's prayer says, may I become at all times a protector for those without protection, a guide for those who have lost their way, a ship for those to cross over, a bridge for those with rivers to cross, a sanctuary for those in danger, a lamp for those without light, a place of refuge for those without shelter, a helper for those in need of help. And my favorite part, which I repeat often for myself, for as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, may I too remain to dispel the misery of the world. This is a long time. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, may I too remain to dispel the misery of the world. This is this gorgeous aspirational intention, right? Also impossible, but so evocative. Yeah. So I'm going to pause there because we had lots of. By the power and truth of our coming together this evening, connecting in words and in silence, may our wise views, our orientation to suffering and the end of suffering, our intention to be of service to the world, may all of that goodness move out in ever widening circles to touch the lives of the many, many beings in all directions. By the power and truth of our practice together, may we, together with all beings, awaken and be free. Thank you all very much.